They called it the Age of Raiders, explorers and fearless warriors sailing across icy seas. But behind the myths of horned helmets and battlefield glory, Viking culture held a darker truth, one written on the bodies of its women. Forget the Hollywood image of shield maidens fighting alongside men in shining armor. For most women in Viking society, life was a constant negotiation between survival, violence, and traditions that could feel more like punishments than protections. Today, we're diving into some of the most brutal, humiliating, and downright shocking things that were done to women in Viking culture. And trust me, by the end, you'll never look at a Viking saga the same way again. Let's start with something the sagas themselves tried to romanticize: marriage. On paper, Viking women had more rights than many of their medieval European counterparts. They could own property, divorce, and even run farms. Sounds progressive, right? But here's the catch. Marriage was rarely about love. It was a business deal. Families traded daughters like cattle, sometimes literally. Dowries weren't just gifts. They were contracts binding two clans together. And if the marriage soured, divorce might technically be an option. But the social stigma for women was crushing. Leaving a husband could mean losing her children, her home, and her social standing in one sweep. And then there were the forced marriages. Picture this: a powerful chieftain looking to expand his influence. Instead of negotiating over land, he arranges for his daughter to be married off to a rival. No choice, no voice, just a girl being handed over like a political chess piece. Even sagas tell of brides weeping at the altar, while families celebrated their strategic victory. Romantic Viking weddings, more like corporate mergers sealed with tears. But the marriage bed came with another layer of horror. In Viking legal codes, women's virginity was treated like property. If a man discovered his bride wasn't a virgin, he could dissolve the marriage and publicly shame her family. Some sagas even describe instances where brides were physically inspected for proof of chastity, turning one of the most intimate aspects of life into a humiliating trial. Still think marriage was just an awkward business arrangement? Let's raise the stakes. Because in Viking Iceland, if a woman was accused of adultery, the punishment wasn't a simple fine or a slap on the wrist. Court records show women could be branded as fayu konig, a word that blurred the line between adulteress and witch. And once you earned that label, you weren't just divorced. You could be exiled, stripped of property, or worse, executed by being buried alive or burned. Imagine being trapped under a mound of dirt while your community watched, your screams muffled by soil, all because you dared step outside the rigid boundaries of marital fidelity. And speaking of witches, Viking society had a complicated obsession with women accused of sorcery. Women who practiced seither, a form of magic tied to prophecy and fate, were both respected and feared. But that respect came at a price. Female seers could be consulted by kings, yet if things went wrong, they were accused of bringing misfortune. Archaeological evidence shows that women suspected of sorcery were sometimes stoned to death, their bodies mutilated, or buried with nails driven through their skulls and bones to pin their spirits down. Imagine living in a society where your spiritual gifts made you powerful, but also painted a target on your back. Now let's talk about war, the Viking world's favorite pastime. The sagas love to brag about women called shield maidens, fierce warriors who fought beside men. But historians agree that these stories were mostly myth, or at best rare exceptions. The reality for women in war was far more horrific. When Vikings raided foreign lands, women were often the first victims. Chronicles from Anglo-Saxon and Irish monks describe entire villages where women were dragged away as slaves. Enslavement wasn't just about labor. Captive women were routinely used as concubines, essentially sex slaves by their captors. Some were branded with hot irons to mark ownership, and others were forced into servitude until they died from overwork or abuse. And Viking men didn't only do this abroad. Women within their own communities could also be enslaved, especially if they were poor or captured from rival clans. Slave women, called thralls, had no rights at all. They could be raped, beaten, or sold like livestock. The children of these women weren't considered legitimate heirs, creating entire generations of people born into permanent servitude. In Viking sagas, thrall women are rarely even given names. They exist as background figures, reminders of a social system built on exploitation. But what about the women who resisted? There's a saga about a woman named Aud the Deep-Minded, who managed to escape after her family was killed. She sailed across the North Atlantic and carved out a life for herself in Iceland. Sounds empowering, right? But here's the grim detail. Aud is celebrated precisely because she was unusual. Most women who tried to escape abusive husbands or slavery didn't end up as legends. They were hunted down, beaten, and sometimes killed as runaways. Viking society valued loyalty and honor, but only when it served men. Women who tried to reclaim autonomy were often crushed beneath those same ideals. Let's return to punishment for a moment, because the Viking legal system had a special flair for humiliation. If a woman insulted a man publicly, something as small as calling him a coward, she could be dragged into court. But here's where it gets twisted. The man could countersue, claiming that her insult emasculated him. In extreme cases, this led to the woman being stripped of her dowry, exiled, or flogged. Imagine living in a society where one sharp tongue lashing could literally cost you your home and your life. And the methods of execution, they weren't just about death, they were about spectacle. Women accused of adultery or sorcery were sometimes drowned in public ceremonies. They'd be bound, thrown into rivers or bogs, and if they floated, that was proof of guilt. If they sank, innocent, but dead anyway. Congratulations, trial complete. But the worst fate reserved for women was something called Naya. This wasn't a physical punishment, but a social death sentence. A woman accused of sexual impropriety, cowardice, or sorcery could be labeled as Nithingr, a person without honor. Once that label stuck, it spread like wildfire. Neighbors wouldn't speak to you, family might abandon you, and in a culture where survival depended on your community, being cut off was often worse than execution. People branded with Naya often wandered into the wilderness, starving to death or taking their own lives. And it wasn't just the accused who suffered. Women whose husbands were nithered could also be cast out, losing their homes and livelihoods overnight. One man's dishonor could ruin an entire household of women who had nothing to do with his crime. That's the hidden cruelty of Viking justice. It didn't just punish individuals, it poisoned entire families. Of course, the sagas sometimes tried to soften this reality with tales of strong women, stories of queens who manipulated politics from behind the scenes, or widows who defended their farms with axes. But even those tales are double-edged, because for every heroic tale of a woman defying expectations, there are 10 stories of women silenced, enslaved, or punished for stepping out of line. The very fact that these few women were remembered tells us how rare survival really was. And here's the real kicker. Viking brutality against women wasn't confined to enemies or outcasts. Even within families, women could be subjected to terrifying customs. One chilling example, the practice of bride capture. If negotiations for a marriage failed, a man might simply kidnap the woman he wanted, sometimes with the help of his family. The sagas describe raids where women were dragged screaming from their homes, forced into marriage, and expected to accept their fate as destiny. Families often turned a blind eye because a captured bride still brought prestige to her new husband. Imagine being told that your abduction was not a crime, but a compliment. The horrors didn't stop at marriage or punishment. Even childbirth, something that should have been a moment of hope, could turn into a nightmare in Viking culture. Archaeological remains and medical texts show that women were often forced to give birth in crude conditions, with almost no medical knowledge beyond herbs and ritual prayers. Midwives existed, but their tools were primitive, and complications were common. A difficult birth didn't just mean danger for the child, it meant death for the mother. And when a woman died in childbirth, the sagas rarely mourned her as an individual. Instead, she became a footnote, her death framed as a necessary sacrifice for continuing the family line. Imagine your life reduced to nothing more than a statistic in someone else's genealogy. And if you think that's grim, consider what happened to the infants. Viking society valued strong, healthy children, but those deemed weak or deformed could be abandoned. The practice of exposing unwanted babies, leaving them on cliffs in forests or by rivers was common. And while boys were sometimes spared, unwanted baby girls were more frequently abandoned. Women were expected to endure the grief of leaving their own daughters to die, forced to prioritize the clan's survival over their maternal instincts. A world where motherhood itself could be weaponized against you. Life didn't get easier. As women aged, old age in Viking culture often meant invisibility. Widows could inherit property, yes, but that made them vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft or manipulation. Older women who held land or influence were frequently dragged into feuds as scapegoats. In one saga, an elderly widow is accused of causing a famine through sorcery. The punishment: she's stoned to death by her neighbors. So much for dignity in your final years. Even burial practices tell a chilling story. High-status women were sometimes honored with elaborate grave goods, jewelry, tools, and even ships. But for every wealthy burial, there are countless others where women were laid to rest with nothing, their bones showing signs of malnutrition and hard labor. Some graves even reveal evidence of ritual killings, where slave women were buried alongside their mistresses, strangled or stabbed to accompany them into the afterlife. Imagine being forced into death, not because of what you did, but because of who you served. And then there were the rituals surrounding honor killings. In a culture obsessed with reputation, women who were accused of disgracing their families could be killed by their own kin. Sagas describe daughters executed by fathers, sisters murdered by brothers, and wives slain by husbands, all to restore family honor. The most harrowing part: these killings were often publicly celebrated, not condemned. Communities viewed them as righteous acts, reinforcing a cycle where women's lives were expendable for the sake of male pride. The Viking legal system codified these cruelties in ways that feel almost surreal today. Laws like the Gragas in Iceland laid out fines and penalties, but when it came to women, the punishments often veered into humiliation. If a woman was accused of lying in court, she could be labeled a Nithingr, her testimony forever disregarded. In effect, one accusation could silence a woman for the rest of her life, and silence was the goal. In Viking poetry, women were often depicted as peace weavers, expected to marry into rival clans to end blood feuds. But the irony was brutal. These same peace weavers were often killed when the feuds reignited. Their blood sealed the peace they were meant to protect. Stories survive of brides being murdered in front of wedding feasts, their deaths sparking new waves of vengeance. The very role that was supposed to protect life became a pathway to destruction. But Viking cruelty toward women wasn't only domestic, it was exported. During raids, women were among the most valuable spoils. The annals of Irish monks describe monasteries sacked, with women dragged off in chains. Some were forced into Viking settlements as concubines. Others were trafficked across Europe in slave markets. A woman captured in Ireland might end up in Scandinavia, Byzantium, or even the Caliphate. The human cost of Viking expansion wasn't just in gold and silver, but in bodies, especially female ones. Those trafficked women faced horrors that defy imagination. Slavery in Viking society wasn't a temporary condition. It was often lifelong. Thralls could be forced into sexual servitude, beaten for disobedience, or sacrificed in religious rituals. Archaeological digs in Scandinavia have uncovered female skeletons with clear evidence of violent deaths, their bodies mutilated in ways consistent with ritual killing. To the Vikings, these women weren't people. They were offerings, commodities, or tools. Religion, too, played its role in reinforcing this brutality. The Norse pantheon is full of powerful goddesses like Freyja and Frigg, but the mythology carries a dark undertone. Freyja, the goddess of love and fertility, is repeatedly accused in the sagas of promiscuity, mocked by male gods in humiliating verses. The myths themselves reinforced cultural ideas that even divine women were objects of ridicule and control. If the gods treated their women with contempt, what hope did mortal women have? Even festivals and celebrations carried hidden dangers. At blots, sacrificial feasts, women sometimes played ceremonial roles, but these could quickly turn deadly. Accounts suggest that during large-scale sacrifices, thralls and captives, often women were killed to appease the gods. Their blood was smeared on altars, their bodies thrown into bogs or wells. Religion provided a convenient mask for cruelty, wrapping murder in the language of devotion. Let's not forget the violence embedded in language itself. Viking insults often revolved around questioning a woman's chastity or loyalty. To call a woman unfaithful or witch was to strip her of social standing, branding her with words that carried life or death consequences. One saga even records a man publicly accusing a woman of sleeping with a thrall. She was humiliated, her children's legitimacy questioned, and her family's honor stained, all from a single insult. Words in Viking society were weapons, and women were the easiest targets. And as much as sagas celebrated men dying gloriously in battle, women's deaths were rarely given dignity. A fallen warrior might be carried to Valhalla in the stories, but a woman who died of disease, childbirth, or abuse, she was barely mentioned. The silence itself is telling. Whole generations of women erased from memory because their deaths weren't considered worthy of song. One particularly grotesque tradition was the treatment of women in blood feuds. If a clan couldn't find male targets to kill, they sometimes murdered female relatives instead. There's an Icelandic saga where an entire family is wiped out, and when only women are left, they too are slaughtered to end the feud. These killings weren't even hidden, they were justified as necessary for balance. A society where vengeance mattered more than mercy. But even in daily life, the weight of violence hung heavy. Women were expected to manage households, farms and children while their husbands raided abroad. Failure to maintain the household could be grounds for divorce or even punishment. Archaeological evidence of women's skeletons shows signs of hard labor, spinal damage from carrying loads, arthritis from grinding grain, and malnutrition from feeding families before themselves. Behind every Viking warrior was a woman breaking her body just to keep life going, with no songs or sagas written for her sacrifice. And when famine struck, women often bore the brunt. Written accounts describe men abandoning households to seek food or raid, while women were left to starve with children. In some cases, desperate families sold their daughters as thralls to survive another winter. The cycle of suffering passed from mothers to daughters, each generation trapped in the same brutal calculus of survival. Even stories of love carry sinister shadows. Take the tale of Gunnlaug's serpent tongue, where two men duel over a woman's hand in marriage. The woman herself, she has no say in the matter. She watches as the men fight to the death, her future decided by violence she can't escape. These stories remind us that even romance in Viking culture was often soaked in blood. The brutality of Viking life for women wasn't only about law, slavery, or war. It was woven into daily rituals, the quiet moments that should have been safe. Take feasts, for example. These gatherings were supposed to be times of celebration, overflowing with mead, music, and boasting. But for women, feasts could be traps. A drunken insult from a man might escalate into a public accusation, and suddenly she could find herself the subject of ridicule, trial, or even punishment. There are sagas where women at feasts were mocked by men for being too outspoken, their words twisted into evidence of witchcraft or infidelity. Imagine sitting at a family dinner and knowing that one wrong sentence could be used to strip away your honor and your safety. And those same feasts often ended in violence. Archaeologists have uncovered remains near Viking banquet halls that suggest women, especially thralls, were sometimes sacrificed after celebrations. Their bodies were dumped in pits alongside animal bones, discarded as offerings to gods or to seal drunken oaths. What was supposed to be a night of joy became another reminder that a woman's life could be cut short at any moment, turned into ritual slaughter in front of a cheering crowd. But it wasn't only feasts, markets too carried dangers. Viking women who tried to trade independently could be accused of overstepping their roles. Merchants might cheat them, knowing that the legal system rarely favored a woman's word over a man's. Thrall women in markets were treated even worse. They weren't selling goods, they were the goods. Slave markets in Scandinavia and abroad openly paraded women, priced not just for their labor, but for their youth, beauty, or ability to bear children. Entire lives reduced to bargaining chips. Domestic life, which we might think of as safer, could also be brutal. Viking households were structured around hierarchy, and women, unless widowed or of high status, were expected to obey male heads of family without question. Disobedience wasn't just frowned upon, it could be punished physically. Saga accounts mention wives beaten for questioning their husbands, or daughters punished for disobedience with whippings or forced confinement. These weren't private matters, neighbors often knew, and communities accepted it as discipline, not abuse. Even religion crept into the private sphere. Household rituals often demanded female participation, but failure could have consequences. If crops failed, livestock sickened, or storms destroyed ships, women could be accused of neglecting rituals, blamed for disasters beyond their control. Some were forced to undergo humiliating purifications, bathing in freezing water, fasting for days, or confessing imagined sins, just to restore their family's reputation. Imagine the crushing weight of knowing every misfortune could be pinned on you, regardless of cause. And then there's the grotesque tradition of slave collars. Some thrall women were forced to wear heavy iron rings around their necks, permanent reminders of their status. These collars weren't just physical restraints, they were symbols of ownership. A woman wearing one could be recognized instantly as property, barred from marriage, and marked forever in her community. Archaeologists have found skeletons of women with deformed spines and damaged vertebrae, likely from years of carrying the weight of these collars. A lifetime of humiliation pressed literally into their bones. Punishments for women often carried an extra layer of spectacle. One method was breaking the back. Women convicted of severe crimes, whether adultery, witchcraft, or theft, could be tied over a sharp stone or beam and beaten until their spines snapped. Accounts from medieval chroniclers described these scenes with chilling detail, noting that the punishments were performed publicly as a warning. Pain wasn't enough. Humiliation had to be complete, and humiliation could be worse than death. Viking women accused of promiscuity sometimes faced punishments designed to strip them of dignity rather than life. One method was shaving their heads. In a culture where long hair symbolized beauty and honor, being forcibly shorn was like branding someone with shame. Some were paraded through villages with their hair cut, mocked as fallen women, condemned to live with a stigma that never faded. In the eyes of society, their shaved heads screamed guilt louder than any court ruling. The same logic extended to clothing. Some women punished for crimes were forced to wear men's garments as a form of ridicule, their gender mocked in front of neighbors. In a hyper-masculine warrior culture, forcing a woman into male dress was meant to strip her identity, a cruel inversion of her role. These punishments didn't kill the body, but they killed reputation, which in Viking society was often a death sentence of its own. And when we turn to war again, the picture grows darker. Viking raids didn't just capture foreign women, they often separated mothers from children. Records describe women dragged onto ships while their infants were left behind to die or sold separately. Some children were killed outright during raids to prevent future revenge. For enslaved mothers, this was the ultimate cruelty, forced to serve their captors while mourning children they'd never see again. A mother's love weaponized against her, twisted into another layer of control. But Viking cruelty didn't always come from strangers. Families themselves could be sources of terror. Women accused of dishonoring their clans could be punished not just by law but by relatives. Brothers or fathers sometimes drowned daughters suspected of shaming them, their bodies hidden in rivers or bogs. Archaeologists in Denmark and Sweden have discovered bog bodies of young women, carefully placed, their deaths aligned with cultural practices of ritual punishment. Their killers weren't outsiders, they were kin. The sagas also reveal the psychological toll of living under constant threat. Women are often described as weeping silently, enduring humiliation, or retreating into bitter silence after tragedies. Their grief becomes background noise in the epics, overshadowed by men's battles and feuds, but the silences are telling. Behind every duel or raid, there were women losing homes, children, and lives, their suffering so common it didn't even merit words. And when women tried to resist, resistance could be deadly. There are accounts of women who killed abusive husbands or masters, only to face execution themselves. One saga tells of a thrall woman who poisoned her master after years of mistreatment. When discovered, she was tortured and burned alive. Her story isn't told as heroism, it's recorded as a warning. Defiance wasn't bravery, it was a crime. Even travel, which we might imagine as a chance for freedom, could turn into a trap. Women who sailed with men faced dangers at sea and in foreign lands. Viking ships carried women both willingly and as captives, but storms, raids, and hunger often turned them into liabilities. Some accounts suggest that, in desperate situations, women and children were thrown overboard to lighten ships during storms. A brutal choice: sacrifice the most vulnerable to save the men. Medicine, what passed for it, was another arena of cruelty. Viking remedies for women's ailments often involved bizarre and dangerous practices. For infertility, women were told to eat raw animal organs, carry amulets of animal bones, or drink potions made from herbs mixed with blood. For menstrual issues, some were forced to lie naked on cold ground or consume ashes of burned plants. These so-called cures likely caused more harm than good, turning suffering bodies into experiments of superstition. And the sacrifices didn't end with life. In death, women's bodies could be used as tools for ritual. Some burials show evidence of women placed in strange positions, with stones over their chests or bodies twisted unnaturally. These weren't accidents, they were intentional acts meant to bind or restrain spirits. Women who were feared in life were controlled even in death, their corpses manipulated to prevent them from haunting the living. Even festivals of fertility, which celebrated life, often exploited women. Some rituals involved symbolic marriages between men and priestesses, but others included coerced sexual acts under the guise of religious duty. Women forced into these roles weren't celebrated, they were used, their bodies turned into offerings to gods demanding devotion in flesh. Through all of this, one theme stands out: women in Viking culture lived in a world where their value was conditional. Conditional on obedience, chastity, fertility, and usefulness. Step outside those conditions, and the consequences were brutal. And what makes it even more haunting is how normalized it all was. These weren't exceptions, they were traditions, laws, rituals, and expectations baked into the very foundation of society. If daily life was harsh, the spectacle of public punishment pushed cruelty to another level. Viking communities treated punishment as theater, a grim form of entertainment. When women were executed, entire villages often gathered to watch. Children stood alongside elders, witnessing drownings, burnings, and floggings as if they were ritual plays. For the condemned woman, there was no escape, not even dignity in her final moments. Every scream, every humiliation was meant to serve as a reminder to others. Death wasn't just a penalty, it was a performance. And some punishments weren't designed to kill quickly. There are accounts of women tied to stakes, left for animals to attack, or exposed to freezing elements until their bodies gave out. The Norse climate itself became a weapon. Being forced to stand bound in icy winds or submerged in frigid water until hypothermia set in was as effective as any blade. Death by nature, choreographed by human cruelty. But even beyond punishments, Viking feuds placed women in impossible positions. Blood feuds between clans could last generations, and women were often caught in the middle. Daughters were traded in marriage to end disputes, only to be killed when feuds reignited. Mothers were expected to push sons into revenge killings, whispering reminders of dishonor into their ears. Refusing to encourage vengeance was seen as weakness, making women bearers of a burden they couldn't escape. They weren't just victims of feuds, they were instruments of them, forced to perpetuate cycles of violence they had no power to end. Children, too, reflected this cruelty. Sons were raised to be warriors, but daughters were raised to serve political ends. A girl's body was a bargaining chip, her fate negotiated at tables where she had no seat. The sagas occasionally show women lashing out against this, cursing families that bartered them away, but those voices are rare. More often, the stories simply record them as silent brides, shipped off to foreign lands, their lives forgotten once the ink dried on a contract. And when famine or disease struck, women bore the heaviest cost. Men left home to raid or find food, but women stayed behind, rationing what little remained. Archaeological studies of Viking-era skeletons show women were more likely to suffer malnutrition than men, their bones marked with deficiencies. That's because in times of scarcity, women often ate last, ensuring children and men were fed first. Survival for others came at the expense of their own health, turning sacrifice into an expectation rather than a choice. Slave women, meanwhile, lived lives of unending terror. They could be beaten for failing to grind enough grain, whipped for failing to clean, and killed if they resisted abuse. Some were forced into breeding arrangements, paired with male slaves to produce more thralls for their masters. The children of these unions were born into chains, their mothers powerless to protect them. In some households, slave women were forced to breastfeed the children of their masters, while their own infants went hungry. Their very bodies turned into resources, drained of choice and dignity. The violence extended even into storytelling itself. Viking sagas often glamorize male violence, but women's suffering is treated as background, a device to motivate men. A woman is abducted, dishonored, or killed, and her fate is used to justify a blood feud or a heroic act of revenge. Her pain is never the story, only the spark for someone else's glory. In this way, even memory itself denied women agency. They weren't characters, they were catalysts. And when Christianity began to spread into Viking lands, things didn't necessarily improve. Conversion brought new rules, new punishments, and new expectations for female obedience. Pagan accusations of witchcraft gave way to Christian accusations of sin. Women's bodies were still battlegrounds, whether for honor, law, or faith. Some sagas describe women caught between old gods and new, punished by both sides, condemned by whichever system held power in the moment. Changing religion didn't erase cruelty, it simply dressed it in different clothes. There's also evidence that Viking justice targeted women with disproportionate brutality when crimes involved sexuality. A man caught in adultery might pay a fine. A woman caught in adultery could be flogged, shorn, drowned, or stoned. Equality before the law was a myth. The same act, when committed by a woman, became a spectacle, a sin worth erasing not only from the community, but from memory itself. And then there's the haunting reality of ritual killings tied to ships. Viking ship burials are legendary. Grand vessels buried with warriors, weapons, and treasures. But some of those ships carried women who didn't go willingly. Archaeologists have found female remains in ship burials, showing signs of violent death, their bodies sacrificed to accompany powerful men into the afterlife. These weren't queens honored alongside kings, they were offerings, forced into death to glorify another's journey. Imagine being buried alive in the freezing earth of a ship's hull, your last breath stolen not by age or illness, but by ritual decree. Even art reflected these cruelties. Viking carvings and tapestries sometimes depict women bound or humiliated, their bodies symbolic of defeat or dishonor. These weren't warnings for men. They were messages to women: obey, submit, endure. Every stitch, every carved line was a silent reinforcement of the roles society demanded. And yet, buried in these grim details, there are flickers of resistance. Women who cursed their oppressors in court, who plotted escapes, who used cunning to survive in a world stacked against them. The sagas remember some of them. Women who wielded words like weapons, who manipulated marriages to carve out power, who avenged wrongs with poison or blade. But those were exceptions, and their stories often end in tragedy. For every remembered act of defiance, there are countless unnamed women whose struggles were erased, their voices silenced by history's indifference. It's easy to imagine the Viking world as one of swords, ships, and gold, but beneath that image was another reality, one written in the lives and deaths of women, a world where survival often meant submission, where dignity could be stripped away in an instant, where law and ritual turned cruelty into custom. Viking women carried burdens we can still trace in bones, in stories, in the silent spaces between saga lines. Their suffering wasn't an anomaly. It was the fabric of a society that celebrated conquest while crushing those with the least power to resist.